Cool, there we go. Can you see my slides okay?
Yep, all good.
Perfect. All right, lovely, thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm really happy to be here this evening to chat to you about all things hedgehog. Yeah, my name's Grace Johnson. I'm here from the Hedgehog Street campaign. So that's a joint campaign by two British wildlife charities, People's Trust for Endangered Species and the British Hedgehog Preservation Society. So a little bit about what I'll be talking about this evening. I'll do a bit of general information about hedgehogs just to sort of catch everybody up. I think everybody knows what a hedgehog is, but a little bit about their sort of behaviour and ecology. A little bit of information about the threats that hedgehogs are facing here in Britain, the Hedgehog Street campaign that I've been working on, the declines that they've been suffering, some of the research that's been going on, and then of course moving on to how to help, because of course there's things that we can all do to help them. And I've got a couple of cool case studies about local projects that are doing really good things, just for a bit of inspiration, and two very new projects that are going on that I'd like to share with you as well. So, first of all, the reason that we're all here today, the hedgehog. So the species that we have here in Britain is the West European hedgehog, and it's one of around 19 hedgehog species worldwide. And I had to update this slide. It previously said 7. Oh, I think my camera's gone. Oh, sorry. Tech issues. So previously, it's thought to have been around 17 species of hedgehogs worldwide. But actually, in the last couple of years, there's been 2 new hedgehogs discovered, I believe in Indonesia, but don't quote me on that. Not sure where sorry, my camera's being a bit naughty. Yeah, so it's Britain's only spiny mammal. The spines are, of course, very charismatic and very unique to the hedgehog. So those spines are made up of keratin, which is the same material as our hair and nails. So they're a bit like a sort of modified hair. In terms of their senses, they actually have quite poor eyesight, and they rely much more on smell and hearing when they're kind of navigating their surroundings. So if anybody's lucky enough to have them in the garden, you'll always see their noses are twitching constantly because they're really taking in their environment through their nose. And they're nocturnal as well. So of course that's, they don't need that sort of, they're not relying on their eyesight because they're navigating in the dark. So of course that's the opposite way around to what we are. They're active at nighttime and asleep during the day. They're omnivorous, so they're mainly going to be eating invertebrates, so creepy crawlies that you'd find in the garden, so things like beetles, earwigs, caterpillars, earthworms. But they're quite opportunistic as well. They'll make use of other things, so things like fallen fruit or carrion. And we've got some fairly grisly videos of them eating things like toads even, which is pretty crazy. But generally it's going to be that sort of creepy crawly prey, and potentially the food that we as humans are putting out as well. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. They're usually brown in colour. I know that sounds a bit strange, but it's because there is a blonde variation as well. You do get blonde hedgehogs, which are very distinctive looking, and they're quite common on the Channel Island of Alderney. They do seem to be sort of, because they're quite sort of genetically limited there, those blonde ones are really sort of really common. And as you can see on the map on the left-hand side there, the clue's in the name. It's the West European hedgehog. They're distributed throughout Western Europe. And they do overlap with other hedgehog species more kind of on the eastern border of their range as well. So in terms of their ecology, what does a year for a hedgehog look like? I thought I'd start with winter because it is, of course, now, and we're all living this cold weather. So they're in hibernation at the moment. So they're going to be hibernating from kind of November time and through until about March. But it really depends on the weather. It depends on the health and body condition of the hedgehog as well. They'll build usually a couple of really sturdy hibernation nests and kind of swap between those during the winter. So they do wake up occasionally to sort of feed, to swap nests, especially when it's mild. And in some cases, increasingly, they don't seem to be hibernating at all, which is quite interesting. And then coming into spring is, of course, the breeding season. So after hibernation, they need to feed a lot. They need to make up that body fat that they've lost. They need to regain their energy. And then we're going to be moving on to the mating season. So males and females will generally mate with multiple partners. They have quite a lengthy courtship. So the male will circle the female, often for kind of hours at a time. There's lots of huffing and puffing, kind of snuffling noises. If you've heard it, you'll know what I mean. and yeah, you've got a better chance of hearing them at that time of year, I would say. So that's certainly, yeah, keep an ear out in the coming months as they start rousing from hibernation. They'll keep mating throughout the spring and early summer before having their hoglets, which is that's of course what the baby hedgehogs are called. The mother will be raising the hedgehogs. The father doesn't have any part in that. They'll usually have around 4 or 5 hoglets, but not all of them will survive. You'll normally get sort of 2 or 3 that'll survive that initial period. The babies usually stay in the nest for kind of 3 or 4 weeks before they start to explore with mum, which is what you can see in this picture here. And then after about maybe kind of 10 days, 2 weeks of exploring with mum and learning how to be a hedgehog and what to eat, what not to eat, they'll start to forage on their own. And then coming into autumn, they'll start to prepare for hibernation again. So they'll be building those sturdy hibernation nests. They'll be eating lots of that creepy crawly prey or food that humans are leaving out. Really trying to build up those fat reserves that are going to see them through that cold winter period when the insect prey is in short supply. They can sometimes have a second litter of hoglets in the autumn, but these ones are usually quite small and struggle to gain enough weight to survive hibernation. So if you do see a very small hedgehog at that time of year, it might be that it's, it could be that it's struggling. So you can always call the British Hedgehog Preservation Society for advice, and they can often put you in touch with a local independent hedgehog carer as well. But they're quite good. You can just call and talk through the situation, see if it's something that might need a bit of attention. And then just a few shameless hoglet pictures because they're of course very cute. So yeah, just that's what they look like. A few nice ones of just to show the kind of litter mates. And you can see at the top right hand side there, that's some really little ones there. They're very, very young, sort of a few hours, days old. They are born without their spines. They're sort of under the skin, and it's filled with fluid to ensure that they can be born safely. And then in the hours after the birth, that fluid under the skin drains and the spines emerge, which is good because if they had to grow those spines, then obviously they would be quite defenseless for quite a long time while they were growing them. Hedgehogs are, of course, a very popular animal. That's the reason that we're all here this evening. They've got a lot of strong public support. People really, really love them, which makes them a brilliant species to work with. They're always topping polls of our, our favorite animal, our favorite mammal species, our favorite wildlife. And there's interestingly quite a lot of examples of hedgehogs in things like ancient Egyptian artifacts and paintings. And that's the long-eared hedgehog rather than the West European one that we have. But it just goes to show that they've been quite sort of important, within human culture for thousands of years. And more recently as well, there's also references to hedgehogs in various Shakespeare plays, which is pretty cool. Next up, of course, is Mrs. Tiggywinkle. So that was first published back in 1905. And it's still very popular today. It's still a real kind of British favourite. Of course, a good one for Cumbria, because Mrs. Tiggywinkle, of course, lived in the Lake District. And finally, I've got a few just pictures of Christmas cards there, but you can find hedgehogs absolutely everywhere. I'm sure you've seen them on cushions, mugs, stationery. As a hedgehog officer, I receive a lot of these things for Christmases and birthdays, and they're just, you can get absolutely everything with a hedgehog on these days, which is quite nice. Hedgehogs are unfortunately declining in Britain. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. They are facing various threats, unfortunately. They're different threats across kind of urban and rural areas. I've listed a few of them here. So you've got things like intensive agriculture. That's, the intensification is a process that's been going on for several decades. What we seem to have nowadays is large kind of monoculture fields. There's often pesticides being used, really trying to maximize the output of the land. And unfortunately, that does mean that there's less kind of food and shelter available for hedgehogs. It's estimated that we've lost around 50% of the hedgerows that we used to have since the Second World War. So there, of course, the clue is in the name. That's a really important habitat for hedgehogs, as well as a lot of other wildlife species as well. Habitat loss. So again, that links to the massive loss of hedgerows, but also there's more and more development going on. There's less of these kind of suitably wild areas, wild diverse areas for hedgehogs to sort of thrive in. Habitat fragmentation is another one. So even when there are nice, suitable wild pockets of habitat for them, they're often going to be broken up by things like roads, by buildings, by walls, just meaning that they can't navigate the landscape safely. And that's going to sort of isolate them genetically as well. They're going to be becoming sort of different, distinct populations. Roadkill, that's of course, a major threat, and it's one of the most visual ones. I'm sure we've all seen, squashed hedgehogs out on the road. That's something that's, a really tricky one to actually address and overcome, but certainly something that we're trying to look at. Badger predation. So badgers are the main natural predator of hedgehogs here in the UK. And hedgehogs do often avoid areas that badgers are residing. But it's really important to note with this one that it's a natural predator-prey interaction. They've been coexisting for thousands of years, and we know that the two species can thrive where, conditions are good and there's enough of that insect prey for them both to feed on. So we think that badgers have an effect at a local level. It can sort of be this avoidance behavior, but at a national scale, badgers aren't the reason for the hedgehog decline. And then garden hazards, I've got a few of those along the bottom there. So because of those lovely distinctive spikes that they have all over their body, it does unfortunately mean that they can very easily get tangled in fencing, in netting, in rubbish, all sorts of things. They're very easily entangled, unfortunately for them. Bonfires along there. So we always do a lot of raising awareness around bonfire night, because it's, that's when they're looking for hibernation nests, and they're going to go into that lovely log pile thinking it's a great place to nest, not realizing how dangerous it is, of course. Things like slug pellets, so chemicals, that we use in the garden, that's going to be killing off the prey that they need to eat, but also it could cause kind of poisoning of the actual hedgehogs themselves. And then that last picture is a garden strimmer. So things like strimmers, lawn mowers, robotic lawn mowers, all of these things can, of course, cause really awful injuries and even death to hedgehogs. So yeah, unfortunately, just some of the threats that they are facing. So unfortunately, these threats have had an effect at a population level. So this is a report that we publish every few years, the State of Britain's Hedgehogs Report. We do this every few years. So the first one was back in, I believe, 2011, then we did 2015, 18, and then 22. So we're kind of using survey data to analyze how populations are changing, sort of checking in every few years and seeing how they're doing. So the most recent report was 2022. And in this one, we saw that there were increasingly apparent differences in the urban versus rural environment, which is really interesting. So in urban areas, actually what we're seeing is a stable population that's starting to show signs of recovery. So it's a little bit of good news, but we really need to bear in mind that this is sort of against the backdrop of quite long-term historic declines. So they've been declining for a number of years, and that decline is just starting to level out, but they're not up to the numbers that they should be. So it's a little bit of good news, but we just need to be a bit cautious with that. On the rural side of things, sadly, populations are remaining low. We've seen declines of between 30 and 75% in different areas since the millennium. So yeah, certainly more of a worrying picture on the rural side of things. So on to a slightly happier topic. So the Hedgehog Street campaign, that's where I'm sort of representing this evening. So this one, the campaign, it's a joint campaign. It's those two charities, People's Trust and the Hedgehog Society. It was set up back in 2011. It was after that first State of Britain's Hedgehogs report, where we'd identified that there were these quite significant population declines happening. And we also identified, I say we, the people who were sort of working on it back then, it was this lack of connectivity in urban areas. They were using gardens, but they couldn't easily access them unless there was, a broken fence or something. So there was this real need to raise awareness of the ways that people can help in urban areas. So the Hedgehog Street project is quite far-reaching. It's primarily based in the sort of urban environment. I've got a few pictures here of the types of things that we do. So attending lots of events to try and engage with members of the public, with people who have gardens, to try and let people know how to help hedgehogs. We support a lot of research projects. That's myself and a colleague in that next picture there, putting up a camera trap to try and spot hedgehogs in a park in London. The next picture is the course that we run. It's a hedgehog ecology and land management course. So we have a really wide variety of people attending that course. So it's people like local councils, the people who manage our parks and green spaces. We get ecologists there, developers, hedgehog rehabilitators, wildlife volunteers, all sorts of people. The next picture there is or was our MP species champion, Chris Grayling. He's not an MP anymore, but we do a lot of work on the policy side of things, so trying to ensure that hedgehogs have as much protection in sort of legislation and policy as possible. And finally, that last picture, we do a lot of media work, trying to take our message out far and wide, the ways that people can help, how people can get involved. We run lots of sort of campaigns and press releases to really try and get as many people involved in what we're doing as possible. We also work with a lot of local groups as well. There's no picture there, but there's a lot of fantastic just local volunteer groups all over Britain, and I try and work with them as much as possible because they're doing really fantastic work on the ground. They're taking our message and kind of knocking on doors and handing out leaflets, and it's really brilliant. So we try and work with them as much as possible. So as part of the Hedgehog Street campaign, we have Hedgehog Champions. So those are the wonderful volunteers that have signed up. It's completely free to sign up. And once you're on there, there's lots of online resources. So you can download things like posters, invitations, slides for a talk, lots of fact sheets, things like that. All of the types of things to help you kind of take that message, engage with neighbours, engage with the local community. There's a gallery on there so you can see everyone's lovely hedgehog pictures from the garden. There's a forum so you can ask questions, you can share your stories and things. And there's news pages on there as well. So we try to, if there's research findings or if there's a new campaign to get involved with, we always put that on there as well. So that's the website address if anybody wants to have a little look as well. So we currently have over 130,000 registered hedgehog champions, and hopefully a few more after this evening. And yeah, as I say, it's all of those resources once you've kind of signed up. It's a really nice community, and we've also got a monthly e-newsletter, which is really nice for just catching up on everything that's happening. It's always seasonal, so it's a bit like, the hibernating at the moment. These are the ways that you can help. This is how you can help when they come out of hibernation. So yeah, definitely worth having a little look on the website for any sort of hedgehog questions that you might have. Another part of the project is the big hedgehog map. So this is where, if you've seen a hedgehog when you're out and about, if it is alive or if it is sadly dead or road killed, you can log it on the map. There's over 190,000 records on there. It is running a little bit slowly because of all those records, so do just sort of give it a moment if you're just trying to kind of have a look and see what's on there. But that is biological data. We share that with the NBN Atlas and local biological record centres as well. And I thought it would be nice to show a bit of a local map as well. So the resolution's not great on this. I kind of couldn't get any further out, to get all of Cumbria in there. But certainly what you can kind of see on there, if that's, I don't know how sort of readable that is, but certainly what we get is sightings clustered around towns and villages. And it's likely that's because that's where hedgehogs are, but it's also where people are, people are seeing them there and logging them. So the records that are really important to log are the ones that you see out in the wider countryside. You don't tend to find them up on the fells in places like the Lake District, although we say that, and then, the hedgehogs don't read the textbooks and we'll find them in the strangest places. But yeah, certainly log those rural sightings so we can get a good picture of that distribution and how it's changing over time. So we've talked a little bit about the threats, but it's important for us to understand kind of how significant these are and how all of the different threats link together as well. So they do vary in different areas. As I was saying, there's these kind of, there's a real split between the urban and the rural side of things. So to that end, we support lots of different research projects, and really we're trying to untangle all of those factors behind the hedgehog decline. So looking at kind of what's going on and also potential solutions as well, because of course that's so important. So there's a lot of projects that are going on at the moment. There's a few that have recently finished, so I thought these would be quite nice to sort of talk about. We're awaiting publication of some of these research papers, but just to give you a bit of a kind of flavour of the types of things that we're looking at. So the first one is developing evidence-based conservation strategies for urban hedgehogs in the UK. That's been done by Abby at the University of Reading. That's her on the top left picture doing a sort of licensed hedgehog survey. So Abby's looking to collect evidence that's going to demonstrate the impact of increasing garden connectivity on hedgehog movement. So in short, it's this idea of hedgehog highways, which I'll talk more about in a moment, but essentially they're just these gaps in fences that let hedgehogs through. So she's been kind of looking at how important they are, how they're used, and also she's been looking at how and why hedgehogs use certain gardens. So what are the real kind of pulls to different gardens, the factors behind that. And she's also been looking at the overwinter activity of hedgehogs in urban areas as well. So if we keep feeding them over winter, does this kind of help them, or is it going to hinder the natural hibernation process? The next project, so this is untangling the roles of prey availability, habitat quality, and predation as predictors of hedgehog abundance. So a bit of a wordy title, but basically what this one's looking at is the relationship between badgers, hedgehogs, and their environment. So we've actually had a paper published, I think, last week on this one, kind of the way that they use their habitats and sort of where there's crossover. So that's really interesting. And then the final one, so this is Lauren Moore's project. So this is it sort of had a few different objectives. Lauren's just writing up her papers at the moment to sort of publish those, but basically looking at roadkill. So trying to determine the proportion of hedgehogs that are killed on roads each year, the different factors that are affecting that, kind of, how roads can isolate populations, that's going to make them more vulnerable. And also she's looking at the value and the efficacy of using tunnels under roads to mitigate this risk. So really important, this one's got a really kind of tangible conservation measure. If it turns out that these tunnels are useful, then maybe we could be kind of pushing those when new infrastructure is developed. So yeah, really exciting. And that one's, we're awaiting publication of that one. So the research is very much looking at those wider issues, those sort of broader topics. It's analysing the decline, looking at all the threats at a population level. But it's so important to bring it back to the individual. What can we do? There's so many ways that we can help hedgehogs. And that's where Hedgehog Street comes in. So it's easy, simple, cheap things. You don't have to have a big garden. There's ways that everybody can get involved. All of these things are going to be so helpful. So first and foremost, we've got hedgehog highways. So I've mentioned those very briefly before in relation to the research. We know that hedgehogs can travel around a mile in a single night, which is such a long way for such a small animal. They're traveling really far. And we know that our urban environment is really fragmented. So these hedgehog highways, these gaps in or under fences, just mean that they can move around freely. And actually, the research that I mentioned on that last slide, so in Abby's research, she did a big survey of our hedgehog champions, and she found that 54% of champions who created hedgehog highways then reported seeing an increase in hedgehog activity. So it just shows, how important these gaps are for hedgehogs. They find them and they do use them, which is brilliant. And so I've got a nice little video here. I'm sure you all know how these gaps work, but it's just quite a nice video to show. Hopefully it's working. Sorry if it's a bit kind of jumpy, but yeah, we had a report from one person who literally put in a highway. She saw a gap in, I think it was her side gate, and then literally that evening she picked up a hedgehog using it on her trail camera. So they find these gaps. They kind of stick to the edges of gardens and things. So if there's a gap there, they'll find it and they'll use it, which is brilliant. So I thought it would be nice to do a quick poll just to kind of gauge, knowledge of hedgehog highways, who might have them. So if we could, yeah, Helen, if you could pop the poll on the screen. So yeah, do you have a hedgehog highway? So that might be that you've deliberately put a gap in there. It might be that there's just a bit of a natural gap where the fence is a little bit broken. It might be that you've got a hedge. Do you not have one? Maybe it's a brick wall. It's a little bit more tricky to put one in. Or do you think that you might, put one in? You're planning one, you're just sort of getting ready for that. I'm going to put my vote in as well there. Cool. So if the results are ready, hopefully everybody's had a bit of a chance to vote. Is it possible to put the results on the screen? Oh, amazing. That's what I love to see. So yeah, large majority, 66% of people have them. 31% don't, but I know they're going to go home and put them in the next few weeks, ready for when hedgehogs are rousing from hibernation. Few people planning one, that's brilliant. There's always issues around, kind of if you've got a solid wall, that does make it more tricky. There's ways to get around it, but obviously it is a bit more tricky. But if you've got any questions about the kind of logistics, you're very welcome to get in touch, because there's always ways to kind of get them in. It's just sort of it's just getting around any issues.
Is that gone from the screen, Grace?
So
Yeah, sorry. I was just checking that had gone.
all good. Yeah, so in terms of the next way to help, really trying to reduce those hazards in the garden. So I mentioned a few of these. Bless them, they have 7,000 spikes on their body. They get tangled in absolutely everything. So making sure that you've dealt with things like litter and netting in the garden, make sure there's nothing kind of in your local environment. Any netting, football, goals, plant netting, anything like that, just make sure it's kind of tied up so it's not going to be affecting them. Ponds is another one, because they're actually quite good swimmers, but if they fall into a high-sided pond, and it's too slippy or too steep for them to get out, they are potentially going to drown, which is awful. So just making sure that ponds have something like this ramp that's pictured here, or if you're putting one in, if you're thinking about a wildlife pond, just make sure it's got a sort of a little beach or like a sloping side so that they're able to sort of get in and out. Go organic, just really, minimize or just ideally eradicate any chemicals from the garden. Bonfires, again, like we say, just make sure we've got lots of advice on the website around bonfires. Just build them on the day that you're going to light them, or move them, because that'll just make sure that there's no hedgehogs in there. And then really important, checking before mowing and strimming. So hedgehog rescues report thousands of these injuries and sort of deaths each year, and it's really awful. And all it takes is just a really careful check. And they're quite well camouflaged. If you've got an area of longer grass that you need to trim, it is quite easy to miss them, but it's so important. You don't want to be causing those accidents. So just, be really, really careful. Moving on to other ways to help. So incorporating wildlife-friendly features into the garden. So it's that natural food that's really important. So we want to be increasing all of those lovely earthworms, beetles, earwigs. So think about log piles, leaf piles, compost heaps. Having a wild corner, just dedicate a corner or a strip of the garden to just, let the grass grow along, let the wildflowers in, and just let it be completely wild and undisturbed. And that's going to provide that lovely food for them, but also shelter and nesting materials. So it's got a sort of double whammy there, all of these lovely features. You can supplement that natural food with kind of food that we put out. So I mentioned earlier, a lot of people do feed hedgehogs. So you can put things like meaty cat or dog food out, a shallow dish of clean, fresh water. That's going to really help them. It's just going to sort of top up their natural diet. And at certain times of year, that's going to be really beneficial. So when they're coming out of hibernation, when they're going into hibernation, all of those times it's going to really help them. It's just gonna sort of top up that natural food. And if you do that, you might be lucky enough, hopefully my videos are coming through okay, but this is quite a nice one. Yeah, you might be lucky enough to see this in the garden. This is one of my favorite videos. All I would say is just make sure to clean those food bowls, because we're thinking there's potentially issues around disease transmission. So just make sure you're keeping those feeding areas nice and clean. Another way to help is hedgehog houses. So you can buy these ready-made online, or we've got instructions if you'd like to make your own. There's a few examples of the different styles here. There's loads of different ones. We haven't, tested every single one to make sure it's safe and to make sure it's okay. But a few key things to kind of stick to would be make sure it's got something like a tunnel entrance, like that bottom left-hand one there, or a bit of a dividing wall inside, just so that, things like foxes or dogs can't sort of reach in and get to them. It just gives them that extra layer of protection. So just make sure there's this, a sort of a baffle inside, or a tunnel entrance. And then just a few examples of them in use, which is really nice. They do use these houses. Sometimes, people have got hedgehogs visiting the garden every night, and the hedgehogs don't use the hedgehog houses, and then other people put them out and there's hedgehogs in them on night one. So it's really difficult to say kind of when they're going to be used, but it's certainly worth putting those out in the garden and just making sure they're in a sort of sheltered spot, kind of towards the back in the, you know, in the shrubs or whatever, just to make sure that they feel nice and safe being in there. And then you can start decorating them as well, like the one at the top right hand one, Hogwarts, absolutely perfect. Hogwarts house. One more video. This is just a silly one. I'm hoping it comes through, but yeah, you can put the hedgehog house out. It's got a nice door for them, but they're inevitably going to try and squeeze in through the window because they're not always the brightest. We love them, but they can be a bit daft sometimes. But it's got through that small gap. It's done quite well. I mean, fair play. And if you don't have a garden, that's absolutely fine. There's still lots of ways to help. So maybe you don't have a garden, you're in flats, or you might be renting. Loads of things that you can do in terms of raising awareness, things like sharing social media posts, talking to friends. You could contact local fencing companies to highlight hedgehog highways. There's always kind of conservation groups, there's friends of groups in local parks. You could contact your local council to sort of put hedgehogs on their radar. We've got loads of advice on the website for ways to help. You know, it doesn't have to be, you know, in a garden. Another great one is just to spread the word. We need to get this message out far and wide. You know, they're struggling species, you know, all of the issues that we listed earlier. So there's, you know, we want to be doing as much as possible. So we aim to inspire and equip people to kind of set up hedgehog streets, speak to neighbours, generally really try and raise awareness. And yeah, as I say earlier, once you're a registered hedgehog champion, you've got access to things like leaflets, posters, invitations. There's also slides and notes on there for a talk as well, if you want to give a talk to your local, you know, local group, local WI, whoever it might be. Yeah, we've got kind of resources on there to support you. So moving on from those kind of ways to help, I just wanted to flag a couple of the biggest sort of campaigns that we've run. So we're very much centered around hedgehog highways. We want to increase this connectivity in the urban landscape. So we've done a couple of big campaigns that have been centered around hedgehog highways, really trying to raise awareness in sort of new and different and kind of creative ways to put it on people's radar. So this was a competition that we ran a couple of years back. We were looking for Britain's biggest hedgehog street. So we wanted to find the street in Britain with the most gardens linked via hedgehog highways. And it was a street in Nottinghamshire that won, and they had 42 hedgehog highways and a thriving population of hedgehogs, which was absolutely brilliant. And that's a picture of the winners, a few residents from the street and a few examples of their hedgehog highways, and they won a very special plaque. So we might potentially run this again in a few years' time. I don't know. We haven't really thought about it, but it would be nice to kind of revisit this every few years and kind of see if anybody can beat that 42 mark. So I'm laying down the gauntlet in Cumbria. We want to get a Cumbrian winner for the next one. Another example of a hedgehog highway campaign that we ran was this one, which was around hedgehog friendly fencing. So this one was more focused on the industry side of things. So as you can see on the right hand side there are fencing options that you can buy that have kind of ready-made hedgehog highways. So those are the gravel boards that go at the bottom of fences. So some companies offer these, which is absolutely brilliant, but we want to see more of them. We want to see these, you know, all of the big companies, you know, we want to see them stocking these items, offering them to customers. You know, we want them to be standard in new fences. So we put together template letters, and we encouraged people to sort of download those letters, send them off to, you know, B&Q, Wix, all these big companies, but also local fencing companies too, really trying to sort of raise awareness. So we got a lot of interest from local fencing companies, which was fantastic. And one of the national companies, Jewson, have pledged to have hedgehog-friendly gravel boards in their range as well, which is brilliant. So it's been a couple of years. They're available, I think, in some stores. They're not online yet, but I think with these big companies, it just takes a while to kind of to develop the product and get it into circulation. So hopefully we'll be seeing more of those as time goes on. So I thought I'd show a few case studies of what some of these brilliant local groups are doing as well. So this is a fantastic example of a community that's really kind of worked together to help hedgehogs. So it's a project that's run by the Kirtlington Wildlife and Conservation Society. It's all volunteers. and they've created over the last few years a hedgehog superhighway. So they've got over 60 gardens linked. They're not all quite in a row, so they didn't win the Britain's biggest Hedgehog Street, but across the entire village, they've got over 60. It'll be more now as well. I think this figure was from last year, but it includes sort of high profile areas like the village pub, the school. They've put these brilliant information boards. You know, if there's a hedgehog highway that's on a sort of busy street, they always put information boards up. They've used footprint tracking tunnels to try and monitor the activity of hedgehogs, so kind of see where they are, where they might be missing. They do nature walks for local residents, which is fantastic. And then you can see on the right-hand side there, it's sort of, I think it's just quite a hilly village. There's a lot of gardens that have a bit of a level change. So one garden will be sort of a foot lower than the garden next to it. So they've built things like this staircase here, just so that the hedgehog can get to the highway and sort of move between gardens, which is absolutely brilliant. So that's an example of the stairway. And then there's also been a very famous ramp hedgehog highway as well. You might have seen this before. It's one that we share quite a lot. So the garden on the other side of the wall kind of starts at the top of that ramp. There's just a level change between the gardens of a couple of feet. And that's me on the right hand side there. So this ramp is waist height. It's quite, it's significant. And that's so that hedgehogs, even though there's this change in levels, they can still move between gardens, and move through the urban environment like we want them to. And I've got a video of that in action as well, because as I say, they find these highways, and hopefully you can see this. So that's a hedgehog using the ramp. It found the ramp, it climbed the ramp, and it got to the next garden, which is absolutely brilliant. So these hedgehog highways do work, even when they're a little bit convoluted like this one. Another nice case study. This one's a bit more on the urban side of things. It's a more urban example, and it's one in London, which is the Wild Chiswick project, which is an absolutely brilliant one. They've used the records from our big hedgehog map and sort of collected sightings from local residents to build a bit of a picture of kind of hedgehogs in Chiswick, just to see kind of where they are, where they're not, what are the kind of barriers. They've also been helping people to install local hedgehog highways, so they got some funding to buy a couple of drills. So you can see Joe, who runs the group on the left-hand side there, with one of these drills. And local residents can book appointments to have someone come and put in a hedgehog highway, which is a really good idea. And a few local projects have done this, because I think some people want to put in a hedgehog highway, but it's a bit like, well, how do I do it? I've got this awkward brick wall. I've got, how do I get it through the fence? And things like this are just really good at kind of overcoming those issues. They do a lot of community talks as well, and they're also working with a local research project as well. So the Zoological Society of London have a kind of hedgehog monitoring project, Hogwatch, and they've got involved with that as well. So really nice project. And then finally, I wanted to talk to you about two new initiatives. You might have seen these. These are kind of new initiatives that have been launched in the last couple of years. So we've got the National Hedgehog Monitoring Programme and the National Hedgehog Conservation Strategy. So firstly, the monitoring programme. So very briefly, we're using this random encounter model. It's basically using camera traps to try and estimate the density of a species in a given area. So how many individual hedgehogs are in a given area. So we're using camera traps. We put 30 camera traps out for 30 days in a 1 kilometre square. We're doing this all over Britain in different habitats to try and get an understanding of sort of density, the number of hedgehogs at these sites. The methodology, I don't quite understand. I think there's only a few people that do understand this, but it's basically using the distance that the animals travel on these cameras kind of through the photographs. And you can convert that with a lot of statistical analysis into density, into a number of how many are at the site. So it's really, really cool, actually. We're working with local hubs all over Britain. So it's wildlife, it's people like Wildlife Trusts, it's local record centres, universities, working with local volunteers to put these cameras out. We then collect in the cameras, we get the little memory cards, and we upload all of these. It's tens of thousands of images, because these trail cameras are obviously triggered by motion. So, you know, when people walk past, when a fox walks past, it's, you know, it's going to take a picture. So it goes through all of these very cool AI filters to get rid of human images, obviously for sort of privacy reasons. And then the AI can tag different images. So it'll tag a hedgehog, it'll tag a fox, or whatever it is in the image. But we also need volunteers to kind of tag these images as well, because the AI is a bit, it's not 100%. So it's a really cool project. I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about kind of the ways to get involved. But really, as the project progresses, we're going to be able to compare hedgehog numbers across different sites, across different habitats, and crucially across different years as well. So it's going to improve our understanding of hedgehog populations and how they're changing. So we need it because we do have some data. So obviously I've mentioned the State of Britain's Hedgehogs report. We do have some hedgehog data, but it's lacking detail. You know, we don't have those actual numbers. It's a kind of, it's a percentage change. We'd like to know more specifically those numbers, how many hedgehogs are in a given area. We'd like to have a more consistent methodology. There's lots of different habitats that they live in. So we want to be able to kind of see, you know, get good data from all of these different habitats. So we need a little bit of uniformity and consistency there. We've got various national and international targets in place to halt and reverse, you know, species declines. But without the data from this monitoring, we're not going to know if these important targets are being reached. So it's things like the targets in the Environment Act. We're trying to sort of halt the decline of species by 2030, things like that. And crucially as well, as an added bonus, it's going to give us really good data on other species as well, because the camera traps aren't going to distinguish, you know, a hedgehog from a badger. So it's going to tell us about lots of different species, which is brilliant. And here's an example of a few of these camera trap images. So as I say, part of the project is getting volunteers. So this is something that everybody here can do. You know, it's just a case of logging in, and you can go through these images and basically tag the animals, the species that you see. And it's a really cool volunteer project. And you can, honestly, it's quite addictive. You can waste hours doing this because you just flick through and you're seeing all these lovely images of our British wildlife. So, you know, you're seeing things like hedgehogs, but then you've got, you know, hares as well. You've got lots of things like pheasants. You've got a pine marten in that top left picture. Like, that's pretty cool. The right-hand side picture is foxes fighting. So we're getting lots of interesting behavior being picked up on the cameras. So I'll share a link at the end, because this is a brilliant project to get involved with. And we've got a lot of these images to kind of go through. So we need, you know, as many people as possible to be getting involved. The other big sort of project that we've been developing over the last few years is the National Hedgehog Conservation Strategy. So this is, you know, we've had a kind of work plan, a bit of a strategy that we've been working on before, but we wanted something more specific. We wanted to use all of these brilliant research findings that we have. We wanted to kind of apply those. So we've developed this. We've worked with a lot of stakeholders. We had a wildlife trust involved. We had people like RSPB, but we've really tried to broaden it out as well. So as well as having those kind of the usual suspects, all of the brilliant kind of other environmental charities, we've also worked with people like farmers. We've worked with major landowners, so people like Network Rail and National Highways, really trying to kind of get as many people, as many stakeholders involved in this strategy as possible. We did various workshops where we kind of did a threat analysis. We looked at all of the different threats that they're facing, kind of what are the drivers, what are the consequences, and we came up with these sort of top threats that we're going to be addressing with the strategy. So I'll put those on the screen now. So just very briefly, the first one, decrease in natural food and habitat. That's we sort of know about that. It's that decline in you know, their invertebrate prey. Vehicle collisions is obviously, that's, you know, we know what that is. We've got unintentional mortality due to human interventions. That's things that we're doing and they're well-meaning, but there could be negative side effects. So increasingly with the supplementary feeding, there's concern that it is helping, but there's concern that there's downsides, and that the downsides could potentially be outweighing the benefits. But we need to do more research on that to be sure. But if you look at things like feeding birds. It's something we've all been doing for a long time, and now there's increasingly research that it's not always a good thing. So it's sort of that needs a little bit of research on that area. The next one is accidental death and misadventure. So that's all of the accidents I was talking about, where they get tangled up, they fall into ponds, they get hit by streamers. The next one is toxin accumulation. So we're focused on rodenticides and microplastics. And then genetic isolation is the final one. So that very much links to that fragmented habitat. It's this kind of issue of them, you've got these distinct populations. They're not really intermingling with each other because they're facing all these barriers. So moving forward, the idea is that the data from the monitoring is going to tell us about sort of potential hotspots and also at-risk populations, and then we can plan targeted conservation accordingly. There's going to be various targets within the new strategy, so the data from the monitoring is going to inform us of how we're getting on with these targets. And really, in summary, these two big things that we've been working on, these two new initiatives, are going to be working together to secure a sustainable future for hedgehogs in Britain. And I'll finish up with a few links there. So yeah, if you'd like to become a hedgehog champion, I would definitely recommend being an NHMP spotter. That's a really, really fun one to get involved with. If you've seen a hedgehog, obviously you can put that on the map. And then our email address if you've got any questions or thoughts or anything. And then, yeah, thank you very much. That's all from me. I think we've got a little bit of time for questions as well. I'll hand back to Helen.
Thank you, Grace. That was wonderful. It was so inspiring to hear about the community action, like the collective action was brilliant. I mean, that's just what we need so much more of, because it obviously is really effective. So yeah, very good.
Absolutely.
So we've had a good few questions, and if anybody has any further questions for Grace, please do pop them in the chat now. I'm just going to start at the beginning. Do we know the main reasons or factors behind the increase in hedgehog population in urban areas?
Do we know the main reasons why?
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting one. So certainly in recent years, there's been a big push on kind of conservation efforts. There's things like the Hedgehog Street campaign that launched kind of 12, 13 years ago. And, it was a really big push on urban areas. So we haven't kind of definitively, we can't say that it was the kind of improvement in urban areas is caused by that, but it's certainly the timing does kind of work out. And what crucially you've got in urban areas is a lot of people, and a lot of people are helping them. They're putting out food, they're making hedgehog highways, and that seems to be the difference. Whereas in rural areas, it's more kind of large areas of land that might not be that kind of hospitable for them. It might not have that lovely diversity that they need. Whereas our gardens can be these lovely micro habitats. They might go to one garden and there might not be much there, but then the next garden it's full of all these lovely earthworms, and it's got a compost heap, and then the next garden might have something else. So these micro habitats are providing quite good diversity for them, and that seems to be it's people that are doing these things. It does seem to be making a difference, but we haven't got the kind of conclusive, we haven't studied it in great detail of this is why there's this difference. But certainly on the rural side, there's these struggles with with habitat and food availability, and then people helping them on the urban side. So that's a good sort of indicator.
Thank you. So Con Elphinstone is asking, there seem to be three groups of European hedgehogs: British and Western Europe. Are there any genetic differences or behavioural differences between them? For example, the blonde hedgehogs on Alderney.
So with the blonde ones, it's a bit like just having kind of a different coloured hair, like we do as people. It's just a sort of difference in their kind of in their chromosomes. And the reason there's more of them on Alderney is because they didn't used to be there, and then somebody's brought over a few, and they've kind of they've bred and become much more populous. And that founding population, there was a couple of them that had that blonde gene, and obviously that's when there's only a few of them that have been brought over and they breed with each other, that's that gene has kind of multiplied, which is quite interesting. In terms of the West European and the East European, you just wouldn't tell them apart it's really difficult. They look so similar, but genetically they are different species. So yeah, it's really interesting. And there's I went to a conference recently actually in Berlin with a lot of researchers that are doing great things in Germany and the Czech Republic. And they're doing much more work on the East European hedgehog because these countries kind of have both species. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff being done, whereas we've just got the West European hedgehog. So that's all the stuff that we do. But yeah, certainly there's these two distinct species across Eastern Europe, which is really interesting.
Thank you. So Alice is asking, which might be a tricky answer really, how do you stop rats eating hedgehog food that you put out?
Yeah, so that can be one of the things, if you put in food out, you're potentially going to get neighborhood cats pinching the food. It might be that it's birds or it's rats or it's slugs or whatever. But with rats, the best trick is so if you have the food in a saucer, put another saucer over the top. And basically, hedgehogs knock off the saucer. They can smell the food, they'll knock off the saucer and eat it. Whereas rats don't do that. They won't knock off the saucer. So it's quite a simple trick, but it seems to do the job. And also rats are, I think it's neophobic. So they fear change and new things. So if you move the feeding station around the garden, they'll be really wary of it. So that's quite a good trick as well. But the saucer trick is that everybody says that works. So definitely do that.
That's so interesting about the rats. I didn't know that. Being neophobic.
Yeah.
Do hedgehogs have territories? I have a hedgehog on my allotment. Would it be likely to be the same one that sticks around?
They don't have territories. They wouldn't defend territories in the same way that other species would, but they do have home ranges. So they'll kind of stick to their home range. A lot of them will kind of follow the same route, each night. So people will often kind of see the same ones, which is quite nice. So yeah, they do stick to certain areas, but they wouldn't defend their territory against other hedgehogs or anything like that. And they're solitary, so they're generally just gonna kind of stay away from each other.
Is there evidence to suggest that the presence of pets like cats and dogs dissuades hedgehogs, even if they're kept inside at night?
There can be issues around that. It's not something that's been kind of studied specifically. So in Abby Gazod's research, when she looked at kind of the factors that affect them coming to gardens, it was more, she was looking at things like supplementary feeding, compost heaps, those kind of features in the garden rather than the presence of pets. So as far as I'm aware, it's not something that's been studied, but certainly, dogs can be a bit of an issue because they can sort of bite hedgehogs and cause infection and things like that. So, and if there's a barking dog, it might be that the hedgehog gets a bit scared and maybe is a bit wary of coming back again. So it's not something that's been studied, but it would make sense if things like dogs were impacting their behavior. But it depends on the dog. Some dogs just have a bit of a sniff and then leave them alone. And cats tend to just leave them be as well. I think once they realize how prickly they are, they tend to keep their distance.
Great. So Alice is asking how many gaps are needed in a garden fence of say 8 meters long for hedgehog
It
highways?
really depends. Again, it hasn't been studied, but as many as you're willing to put in, really. I mean, they're going to follow those edges. So ideally, at least one onto each, each bordering garden. So if you've got one on your right, one on your left, maybe one at the top end, trying to kind of put at least one in each of those boundaries would be brilliant because it's that we want to maximize that connectivity and thinking about kind of side gates as well, linking front to back gardens. But yeah, it's a really interesting question, and we get a lot of people like councils getting in touch and they say we've got this 300-meter long fence. How many highways do we need? And it's not something that's been studied. So I tend to just say as many as you can. Really, it's they'll kind of naturally follow those boundaries, so they will find them. But yeah, in an 8-meter fence, yeah, ideally at least one. You could put a couple in, but I think that's not a huge distance, so they should, if there's one in there, on each kind of side, then they should find that.
Great, thank you. So we've just got 2 more questions left. So Grace is asking, has any work been done with all the new housing developments going on? For example, things they must put in place when building.
Yeah, so we would love for all new developments to have hedgehog highways. We're really pushing for that. There's a big petition that's going to kind of to encourage that. It's there's a lot of changes happening at the minute with kind of planning and all of these regulations and things, but we've traditionally worked with a lot of developers. So we've worked with people like Taylor Wimpey. The RSPB are working with Barrett, kind of David Wilson homes, to try and get these wildlife friendly measures put into these new builds. But at the moment, there's not really, they don't have to put in hedgehog highways. They're sort of the ones that do are kind of choosing to. They're going a little bit above and beyond. So there's a lot of developers starting to do that, which is brilliant, but it's not compulsory and it's not happening across the board. But maybe one day it will. That's the dream.
And lastly, I put food out. Fiona's asking. I put food out at the time of year that hedgehogs visit my garden, but I've stopped for winter and haven't seen any since November. Is this the best approach? I still put trail cams out, so we'll hopefully spot them appearing soon.
Great to hear you've got them in the garden. I'm very jealous. Yeah, so we recommend just kind of feeding, as long as that food's being taken, so they are hibernating at the moment. So if, they don't seem to be coming to the garden, or they kind of stop taking the food in November, it's fine just to kind of pull back on the feeding. But if you did spot them on the trail camera, or if there was any kind of really mild periods of weather, that's when they can rouse during hibernation. They'll sort of wake up and be looking for food. So in those circumstances, you could put a little bit out again, maybe just put a small amount of dry food that's kind of not going to spoil as quickly. Just leave that out, and then when if you notice it's being taken, then you can put more out. But if it's not being taken, you could maybe reduce it a bit. But yeah, it sounds like what you're doing is fine. You've pulled back a bit while they're hibernating, and then you can, once you start seeing them on the trail cam, you can start putting it out again. I think that sounds like a sensible approach.
Great, thank you. That was our last question, and very handily, we've just almost come to past, so we're almost bang on time. Thank you everybody very much for joining us this evening. I hope you've learned a lot. This talk has been recorded, so you'll get an email from me tomorrow with a recording, and you can watch back and take down any notes or anything that you need to remind yourself of. Just a quick plug for our next online talk. It's on the 11th of March, Tuesday the 11th of March, and it's all about our restoration at Nichols Moss Nature Reserve, which is a peatland, and we've done some quite interesting peatland restoration work, so it's well worth joining us for that one. And I'll pop a link to that in the email that I send you tomorrow. So Grace, is there anything else you want to say before we head off for the evening?
I don't think so. Just thank you very much for having me. I'm just looking at the comments. Someone's saying going on the monitoring, it's going to keep her off Candy Crush. I love that. It's such a good alternative to Candy Crush. But yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been a really good evening. Thank you for everyone. Thanks everyone for coming.
Wonderful. All right, brilliant. We'll say good night. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.